This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on third-party issues, state board issues, contracting, pharmacy purchase and sales issues, and more, especially in the context of fraud and compliance. Reach out now at darshan@kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. You can also just visit our website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm here with my guest. I've had him on a few times before. He is world-renowned as one of the preeminent technologists in the space of clinical research. Our guest, Mo Alsumidaie. And Mo, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Darshan. I'm not sure I'm world-renowned. I appreciate the praise here. My name is Mo, and I am head of research here at Clinibiz, and we use technology and automation to make clinical trials more efficient and affordable.
Mo, so we're going to talk a little bit about decentralized clinical research. And you and I have had multiple conversations online, but I figured it was a good time to actually record it because everyone's talking about it. And I personally go, we don't actually even know what it means because people have thrown definitions around and experts within the space. So it's not like people are naive about it. So let's start with the definition of what exactly is a decentralized study or decentralized clinical research. What do you think it is?
So I would like to go by what the industry leaders define DCTs as. And if you look at the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, or DTRA, it's a nonprofit organization headed up by Craig Lipset, focused on decentralized trials. And according to them, a DCT is a clinical trial utilizing technology, processes, and or services that create the opportunity to reduce or eliminate the need for participants to physically visit a traditional research site. So essentially, that's what DCTs are defined as, according to industry leaders. Now, whether the industry actually thinks that that's DCT or not is a different question. And, several industry personnel are confused about the concept. A lot of tech companies are and also service providers are just jumping on the DCT bandwagon because it's been a hot topic. Although there are some skeptics out there about DCTs. So it's been really interesting to see this particular initiative arise because it's not like some of the previous initiatives we've seen spearheaded by FDA, for instance. FDA focused on risk-based monitoring, for example, or RBM, and offered guidances on those, and then the industry followed those guidances. But in this case, DCTs sort of moved forward ahead of regulators. So regulators just starting to catch up on that, which I find really fascinating because it's almost as if the industry has to define it first before regulators even do anything about it. But regulators are very interested in it too. So
I'm gonna approach this topic more unusually than I usually do these podcasts. Usually I just let an expert like you talk. I think that this is gonna be a fun one because I think we can engage in some discussion. Specifically, I think DTRA is a wonderful organization and I have a great amount of respect for Craig, but I think that definition has all the hallmarks of a lawyer writing it. And what I mean by that is this idea that it talks about the use of technology. Well, all types of sites at this point are using technology. So I'm not sure that's really a differentiation point. I think the big difference is the use of a non-traditional, and I forget how he phrased it, but a non-traditional site. I don't even know what that means. To me, what exactly is a traditional site? What fits into that definition? And maybe we should have Craig at some point come on and tell us what we're missing. Or maybe it's intentionally fuzzy right now because we're still trying to define what that means. But to me, this is one of those beasts that is whatever you want it to mean at that moment. So let's start with you. Do you understand what that language means? Because I'm seeing all these new players, and I'm seeing it be more an effort by industry to go. There are new players in this world, in this arena, if you will, who want to make money in this process. How do we give them a voice? And let's create a whole system around it, as opposed to a need for it. So what is your take on this?
So it's an interesting discussion topic because what I've seen that I think are DCTs, or essentially DCT type services or technologies, it really involves building the trial around the patient, right?
But then how is that different from patient-centric? I mean, one might argue that the next term becomes patient-centric clinical trials. I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. I'm just saying that building it around the patient would then be patient-centric clinical trials.
Well, there's a difference because patient centricity involves engaging patients during protocol design to design the protocol in a way that addresses their medical needs. For example, if I have a migraine study, I want to take a look at what sorts of endpoints as a patient do I care about, right? And how can we design the study where the patient is not coming into the office every 2 days, right? Like, that's what patient centricity is. Decentralized clinical trials is bringing the trial to the patient's home and in their environment, right?
I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm saying that again, one of the reasons I have an issue with a term like this, or that is so fuzzy, is that, again, patient-centric clinical trials to me is itself a fuzzy title. Because yes, you're right. People have defined it as getting patient input into trial design, but very easily could include the use of technology to make the life of a patient easier in participating in a clinical trial. And you talked about bringing it into the patient home. I might argue that a DCT could very easily include the new players of Walgreens and CVS, all saying that we are this new technology. We are the players in decentralized studies. It's not about being in the patient's home. It's about convenience for patients, so it's easier to access from home. So my take on this would be, I just read this link somewhere. I'm sure I could forward it if necessary. But it said like the average patient travels something like 67 miles for the average study per study visit, and that's a huge burden to take. And yes, something like telemedicine could very easily help with that, but so could going the extra 5 miles to go to a pharmacy. So is that still DCT, or is that outside the scope of being DCT, and it's now more patient-centric? Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. So there is some melding that happens, right? Because patient centricity is what DCT used to be called, like 7 years ago, right? So, but it wasn't really a concept. It was kind of like, it fell into the clinical innovation departments in pharma back then, when there were clinical innovation departments at Lilly, for example, and they had their own. They even constructed their own study site simulation, where they brought in the patients and they said, okay, well, this is what the study visit is going to look like. And they designed the protocols around that. Now, pharmacies, what's really interesting is, Ken Getz has been talking about pharmacies for many, many, many years, like back in 2013. So, some of the things he found in his research is that patients visit their pharmacies like 5 times more than they would visit their PCPs. For example, annually they visit their pharmacies 30 times versus 3 times at their PCPs. And what's also interesting about pharmacies is that people are, in general, very likely to, according to Ken's research, are a lot more likely to participate in a study if it comes from someone who is a medical professional, like a pharmacist, for instance. And so the platform of, running patient recruitments, for example, in a pharmacy setting has been a topic of discussion for a long time. Now, the challenge, I think, that right now pharmacies are getting into it. You see CVS Health, I just published a interview with CVS on the topic. And, it's still pretty new to them to operate as a clinical trial. But what's really cool about pharmacies is that it provides access to patients that would otherwise not be able to access the clinic. So as you were saying, they have to drive like 60 miles or so to get to a doctor or study site, when you can drive like 5 miles to be at the pharmacy. That opens access to diversity, or, and make it a lot more convenient for the patient. So think about retention, clinical trial retention. So there are operating models that are coming out. Another example would be like traveling nurses to do blood draws at the patient's home, for instance, right? When you look at ECOA or EPROS, like, okay, that's been decentralized for a long time. It just hasn't been defined as that. But it's essentially, that's my perspective on that topic.
So I guess I'm sort of taking, and I admittedly am trying to really delve into this issue, because it is becoming a groundswell of information, and people are going, we're interested in doing VCT trials. And I love the idea of people doing that, if someone can tell me what that means. And my big struggle, for example, is pharmacies want to do that. I can't tell whether pharmacies at this moment are saying, you know what we want to do? We want to do the study itself at the pharmacy. That's one model. I can see that being extremely successful. You're seeing the CVS Healths of the world bring on, they actually have a location in their site where they were doing vaccine administrations. Tomorrow you could have a conversation about enrolling into a study and doing the appropriate testing, etc. Tomorrow you could see another conversation going, we can just do enrollment, because the truth is we have a really good database of people, and possibly better than the individual doctor, because we're talking on multiple doctors sending your patients here. All of which could be accurate, or it could be, we're just going to do the pharmacovigilance part of this. So is the pharmacy supposed to be a replacement for the site, or an augmenter for the site? And is that what DCT means, where some functions are outsourced from the quote unquote traditional site to the pharmacy to do? And I remember seeing someone saying that we're going to augment what the traditional site says, and I have no idea what the word augment means. And maybe the point is that you don't have to define everything right now, and those will eventually be determined. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is, if you're engaging in clinical research, decentralized clinical research, and the point of it was in many senses being patient-centric, possibly reducing cost, are we going to be there, or is this going to be more similar to risk-based monitoring, where everyone said we do risk-based monitoring? What really landed up happening was we do risk-based monitoring in addition to traditional monitoring, so your costs are actually higher, not lower.
Right. So when you talk about that quote, I think I know which quote you're referring to. It's Jill Pellegrino, who, she's the VP, I believe, of she's the VP of recruitment and RWE, or real world evidence, at CVS, Clinical Trial Services.
That could be right.
And one of the things I asked her in this interview is, how do you anticipate existing study sites will react as CVS Health starts to grow in clinical trials? So she said, we've had positive receptivity from clinical sites. Our ability to source patients and use our centers for patient visits or tests is welcomed. CVS Health can be a strong partner for traditional clinical sites. So essentially, CVS sees themselves as a partner to sites. But I mean, that's yet to be determined. I mean, some sites view them as competition, right? Because they could be taking the studies away from the sites. and they can scale it, because they have those minute clinics.
Right.
I mean, when it comes to the confusion around DCTs, I did have another publication on this. It's called Decentralized Clinical Trials is Muddled. And I obtained feedback from some of my audiences on the topic, and I can tell you what study sites are saying.
Please.
So specifically, the sites are saying the environment is still very muddy. Many sponsors refuse to take even the smallest step towards a simple DCT solution. I've attempted to persuade sponsors to adopt site-side solutions, but they're not interested. Eventually, I'm sure some things will begin to stabilize, but right now everything seems to be in disarray. Another site personnel said DCT or hybrid trials are a fantastic idea, but their execution is subpar because planning ignores the trial sites. So it just seems that there's still a lot to be had, because when RBM came out, sure, it was slightly, not clear in the beginning, but the general concept was there and sponsors felt comfortable doing that. But right now, sponsors, to me, sort of did DCTs out of a necessity in or during the pandemic. However, some people are saying that, are afraid that it may not continue. Nonetheless, when I spoke to Barbara Lopez Coons, she's the head of DIA. She believes that DCTs are here to stay. And I recently attended the DTRA conference, and regulators showed up to this conference discussing DCTs, and it's here to stay. Guidance will come out on it at some point. So it's a matter of, I think, adoption and eventual migration to DCTs. It's just a matter of going through the motions of trying and failing and working with regulators to generate a solid guidance and harmonize the process.
It's funny. I have two separate comments. I'm hearing an echo, by the way. But okay, so the first comment I have is I just realized that if CVS and Walgreens and Walmart are successful in what they're doing, they will achieve the vaunted the goal that sites have had for a long time, which is getting true blue SMO status together. So I know, for example, Brad and Dan and both Dans and several others have been talking about the lack of power that sites have when they compare to dealing with sponsors and with CROs. I feel like there'll be a power differential shift once you have beasts like CVS or Walgreens in the mix, because they can go, we don't need to do business with you. This is a small part of our revenue. We have data, you don't. We have subjects, you don't. So that can be good for sites. It may also mean that individual smaller sites lose power because they won't have the same type of access to patients, access to subjects like a Walgreens or a CVS, which I think could be very scary. It's interesting you talk about regulators. From my perspective, one of the interesting things is if you are a regulator, especially the US FDA, my experience with the FDA is they tend to be quiet. They don't tend to opine on things until things have settled down. Because from their perspective, there's no advantage to opining on something and then that thing changing. So it's in their best interest. I mean, patient centricity has literally been around for 20 something years. And we've just started seeing guidance, I'd say minimal guidance around patient-centric trials. So, and it's even 20 something years might be pushing it, might be longer than that. My point being, the FDA has no incentive to go, let me clarify DCT for you. My bigger question is, if you are a Walgreens or a Walmart or a CVS, you don't have a PI for the most part. Nothing that the FDA would consider to be adequate to be a PI, even though they are now starting to talk about locating a nurse practitioner or the like at these sites. But that I think is a major differentiation point. Do you feel like CVS is one of those sleeping tigers? That's I think how they used to describe China probably about 15 years ago, the sleeping tiger, waiting for the time when it's ready to act. But for now, it makes more sense for it to just observe, watch, and learn. Or do you think that the truth is the long-term play is moving away from pharmacies, moving away from sites, and really being in the patient's home? And the real people to watch out for is the Amazons of the world who are going to try to do the study inside your house. And no one's really talking about Amazon yet. So I'm curious what your take is.
Yeah, I mean, the tech companies seemed to want to get into this industry and have been trying to get into this industry for a long time. But I think what they realize is that this industry doesn't work like technology does.
Right.
Things don't happen overnight, and you have to be established, and you have to keep trying and trying and trying, and until you have a reputation. So really, when it comes down to it, are the CVSs and the Walgreens of the world sleeping tigers or not? I mean, I could see two potential options. They could turn into epic failures, complete epic failures, or if they do it right and they're strategic about it, then we really have something to discuss, because those are publicly traded companies, right? And these publicly traded companies, they've never gotten into clinical trials before.
Nope.
And a lot of companies have gotten into clinical trials before and have failed, right? They're in one business line and then it just failed. So right. I think, even though you hire people to do it, if you don't set up the infrastructure correctly, and if you're not serious about it, if all you have is just like telling your investors, oh yeah, we're getting into clinical trials, it's one thing to say it, but another thing to execute it, and another to execute it seamlessly, right, without any quality related issues, and dealing with the costs associated with clinical trials. I mean, clinical trials, if it's not set up correctly, can easily turn into a money losing situation. And that's why so many PIs or study sites leave and never do a clinical trial after their first study, because they just never figured out how to operate it in a way that was profitable for them. So as a business, I think they need to take a look at, firstly, which therapeutic indications are going to generate the most revenue for them. Second, which is going to be the most beneficial for their patient base. And last, evaluate their capabilities and compare that against the needs of the biopharmaceutical industry. So is CVS going to run, oncology trials, or Walgreens going to run oncology trials? It's possible. I mean, Walgreens has a specialty pharmacy where they give chemo to patients, right? So it's all very possible to do some of these studies, right? It's just a matter of how do you set up your clinical operational infrastructure to deal with those risks? And that's something study sites have gotten used to, because they first started out as unprofitable initiatives, but they're passionate about the research, and eventually the operations and the scale comes afterwards.
It's interesting you talk about this, because for me, the idea is the key word you mentioned, which is passion. The truth is, people get into clinical trials thinking that it's going to be extremely profitable, but realize very quickly that you can't, between the issues of fair market value and payment associated with fair market value, and several other DOJ oversight and payment timelines, etc. It's very difficult to make a profit if you aren't used to what you're about to walk into. The big question you'll end up facing is, are those problems that are unique to smaller sites. And does a CVS or a Walgreens or a Walmart not have those issues because they simply go to the sponsor or go to the CRO and say, we're not agreeing to these terms. We're not agreeing to payment in 90 days after submission of invoice. And then you guys check what we have. We're going to have a pool of money. We're going to pull from that pool of money, and we will always be ahead of payment. That could land up being really good for all the other sites because it sets up a new benchmark that other sites can compare to. The second thing I think is kind of interesting, I don't know the answer to this question, is why are CVS and Walgreens and Walmart getting into this space? And the reason I struggle with this is because unlike what everyone else thinks, it's a whole different set of education. It's not simply health, so clinical trials. GCP is a different beast. And it's a pain for the average site to keep their individuals appropriately trained. Now you take a situation where you've got, I have no idea how many pharmacies there are, but let's say there are 20,000 pharmacies across the country. Are you going to train all of them? Are you going to train the pharmacists? I mean, pharmacists are quitting and leaving their jobs because they're saying, we're too busy. I'd rather not have your $100,000 in income, and I'd rather just do a different job because it's not fulfilling. Or is this about job fulfillment? And they're saying that you can do something different, but how do you do that in a world with metrics? And you have to have a number of prescriptions that have to be filled at any given time. And you're combining that with vaccine rates and all that good stuff. So to me, this idea of pharmacies coming into the space is interesting, mostly because it doesn't make that much sense to me. But I'm wondering whether that made sense to you. And do you still stand by this idea that pharmacies will continue to be service providers, or this is their first toe into a space that they're going to very quickly realize is a much different beast than they thought?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what CVS was saying, I mean, they mentioned that they've engaged in clinical trials for years before this even. Specifically, they've engaged more than 300,000 volunteers and helped connect them with local study sites or studies at study sites.
Sure.
Whether, I mean, this is what they're saying, right?
Sure.
And honestly, I've been trying to get pharmacies to get into clinical trials for 7 years ago. Right. I sat down with the management team at Walgreens at the time to discuss this initiative. One of the things I can say is that I'm not really certain that pharmacies understand what it takes to run clinical trials. And if they're going to do it at scale, they have to set up specific departments that specialize in certain things. For example, clinical supply chain, right? Managing investigational product. That's one thing they're very good at doing, is investigational product and drug management, right? And dispensation and documenting all of that. But they need to have things at scale and build it almost like a CRO, because there has to be oversight programs and a culture of quality, right? And to build a culture of quality, which right now is being evangelized by regulators, by the way.
Yeah.
To have a culture of quality, you have to have personnel and a culture in clinical research to begin with. So referring patients to a study site is not a culture of quality. Having QA personnel, having solid training programs, having specific personnel and people who are part of CVS to oversee the study internally, to deal with internal monitoring and audits, to have good quality training programs for people specifically working in clinical research. You have to have managers overseeing the site staff, right? Systems need to be built. Technology systems need to be built to track everything, to track the payments, to track the patients, to track adverse events. I mean, the study scaling is a double-edged sword, because it can be great if it works well and can be very profitable. However, on the other end, if you don't have it set up correctly, not only one, but hundreds of adverse events could go missing if you don't have a good process in place. And that can lead to serious issues with FDA.
Mm-hmm.
And let's also talk about FDA. So like how, are there resources allocated to dealing with FDA audits, at scale? Right. So I think that what these pharmacies have to do is really work with sponsors closely on studies they know they can handle, and then slowly learn from those studies, grow their internal business, and then start to scale. Because, if I'm a sponsor and I say, I want to access and tap into diverse patient populations, and the pharmacies say, sure, we've got these clinics inside of our pharmacies and we'll just do it. And we'll just target people in, remote rural areas. Well, who's going to be the staff there, right? How are you going to implement a quality of culture in those areas, right? Where do you find the talent to do that? Those are all things that are not very clear to me, which I'm sure they're working on, right? I don't know anything about what's going on in those pharmacies, but those are most certainly some things they should be thinking about when they approach this.
But that's the question. I mean, I'm agreeing with you on almost everything you're saying. My question is, why? Why not perfect your minute clinics? Why not get into on-site infusion, for example? Those are easier things. They already have a lot of these processes figured out. All you're adding on is a couple of nurses to infuse, or a couple of doctors to oversee, or whatever it is. Why take on a whole new beast with all new agencies, all looking over your shoulder for, I'm not even sure, a profit margin that's going to touch your bottom line? It's effectively a rounding error for you. So I don't fully understand the thought process. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying I don't understand it. And again, I'm going to take this to mean that there is something there. I mean, I can't tell if this is a situation where CVS did it because they just wanted to be different, and now Walgreens goes, we can't not be doing this. And Walmart goes, if these guys are in that space, I guess I got to be there too. Or is this a space where someone's just gone, yeah, this makes sense? And if so, I really wish that they would put out more information on what they consider to be their sweet spot, because I'm not seeing that sweet spot yet. And I work in both the pharmacy space and the pharma space. So that was my first consideration. We haven't even gotten into the whole issue of technology and using them as a discussion on what that means in the context of decentralized clinical research. So stay tuned. We're going to have that discussion. We're well over time right now, but this is such a fun conversation. Mo, any parting words?
I think that sponsors should continue to explore DCTs. Regulators certainly are out there and are paying attention to it. And they have expressed that, they want the industry to do more trial and errors before they, draft guidance documents. FDA did mention to refer to its COVID-19 pandemic guidance document if there are questions around how to implement DCTs. I think pharmacies are really well positioned if they get into clinical trials and do it in the right way and carefully. It can turn into something that is beneficial for patients, beneficial for the pharmacy and its shareholders. But if not done correctly, again, could be a complete and epic failure. And then last, I want to say that, keep pushing this, despite, wanting to go back to traditional methods. Think about DCTs in every aspect of your study, and think of creative ways to do decentralized clinical trials, because patients really appreciate it, So those are my parting words.
Perfect. Thank you again, Mo. This was wonderful. I can't wait to have you back on again. And for those people who are trying to reach you, Mo, how can people reach you?
You can send me an email, mo@clinibiz.com.
Perfect. And thank you again.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not